the legendary buzzkill Ron Jeremy is not only the judge in the film, but he's also the guy who rapes me in jail.
Welcome to Self-Made and Sober. I'm your host, Andrew Lassis with selfmade-coaching.com. And in this podcast, it's my job to interview people who are not only crushing it in business, but have also struggled with addiction in the past and are in long-term recovery. Be sure to join our Facebook group where we help entrepreneurs grow and scale their business at facebook.com/groups/SMC Mastermind, like Self-Made Coaching Mastermind. I hope you enjoy the show, and be sure to subscribe and rate the show afterwards so you can get notified each Friday when we put out a new episode. With me today, we have a real treat. We have Todd Z-Man Zalkins. Todd's a certified family crisis interventionist, public speaker, host of the Z-Man podcast with Todd Zalkins. He's a best-selling author with his book Dying for Triplicate. And on top of all this, he's a documentary filmmaker, and his award-winning film, The Long Way Back, The Story of Todd Z-Man Zalkins, can be seen on Hulu, Amazon, Google Play, and iTunes. Todd, so grateful to have you on the show. How is everything?
Everything's good, man. Thank you for having me on today, Andrew. And it's like we're in each other's living room. It's just by computer.
Yeah. So basically, it's the exact same thing as being in the living room when you're when you're in the other side of the country and over a computer. Same thing.
Yeah, man. I'm just hanging out here doing this at my office here in Long Beach, California. And thank you for having me on.
Definitely. So why don't you give the listeners a background of who you are, where you came from, and what sort of led to, where you ended up?
God, we'll do a short version here. I'm sure everybody wants to hear a short version. My name's Todd Zalkins, and I'm thankful to be in recovery. The 12-step program of recovery saved my life. I have a sobriety date of February 17th, 2007. And every day of those sober days I've had is because of something a lot bigger than me and a wonderful group of men who helped save my life, and just had to do a couple of things around here in order to get it, to keep it. So a little bit about my background. I grew up here in Long Beach, California, a little area called Belmont Shore, and it was one of those communities where most of us grew up surfing and really into like punk rock music, and backyard parties kind of dominated our landscape. And some of my closest friends are some of the best musicians from around this area, and there's just a ton of them. So keg parties and surfing and chasing girls that was what we did, and it started out innocent, as far as from the drinking perspective, but boy, oh boy, around the corner were some things that were much heavier and much more life-threatening to me as time moved on. Do you want me just out of curiosity, we talk more about the story here, what it was like growing up here, and then what I got into, what almost killed me? What do you want? Talk to me.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. Like if say it were like a 12-step meeting and you're given the experience, strength, and hope, touch on, your story is one of those where it's just like, okay, what crazy part will you touch on? But basically, whatever you would be comfortable sharing about, just growing up and what
Sure.
you guys started getting into and things like that.
Okay, yeah, well, I'll treat it just like that then. First off, for those who may be watching right now and listening later, if you're new to recovery, I want to welcome you, and I want you guys to know that recovery is possible, and thank goodness there's lots of examples for us who are sick with alcoholism and drug addiction. There's a lot of people who've come before us who can help pave the way to help us live differently. And so if you're struggling, there is help out there, and I'll certainly give you my contact information if you just want to talk or chat by email. It's all good. But as I mentioned before in the front end here, I grew up in Long Beach, and I'm a product of a really gnarly alcoholic father. He was 6'4". He boxed in the Marine Corps, and he too grew up in Long Beach. And with my dad, I never knew what I was gonna get. I often say it was either a hug or a left hook, and I've often said that left hook that I would get as a kid, it wouldn't just hurt at the moment, it hurt for years. The lasting impression that type of fear that occurs on a young person or for a young person is something that it's tough to measure, but I'm sure that there's some people who can probably relate. So I found myself as a young boy wanting really everyone to like me. I was certainly a class clown, and I'd like to consider or believe I've got a decent sense of humor, but I really did want everybody to like me, and I could gel into any crowd, and just alcohol certainly became that great persuader, and it allows one to be chameleon-like, whether it's the preppy, upbeat parties or the parties where I mostly love, which is where the punkers were, and the music scene. And so I could adapt into anything. But I took my first drink. I was pretty young. I guess I could call it my first drink. My dad left my mom when I was 7. My older brother was 10. And he would pick us up. When he would show up, he'd have a tall boy between his lap. And he was living down the road in a place called Huntington Harbor, which is this little beach town about 15 minutes south of Long Beach. And so when he would show up, which by the way wasn't often, I now know that to be a byproduct of alcoholism, that we're not really present for people that we love when we're in the disease. But so I get a big pull off this Schlitz tall boy or Olympia tall boy. I'm like 7. We'd go to his house, and he loved to watch football on the weekends, and so I'd bring him beers. He'd ultimately would pass out, and I would keep drinking his beers. But I really wouldn't consider that my first drunken experience. I was with my buddy George Andrew. May he rest in peace. George and I were playing Little League Baseball. We saw the cool older dudes in this park, man, playing basketball, and they had all these hot chicks, and they're drinking this keg beer and then these big cups, and they invited us over. Our uniforms are all dirty and shit like that. And we're like, yeah, we'll go over there and hang out. And, these are guys who are 6, 7 years older, and when you're, 12, these are like men, they're like big, scary dudes. But I always remember it's like they were the best surfers in town, and they had the prettiest ladies, and it's like, man, what are they doing? So next thing you know, George and I, about an hour and a half later, we awake in this little park across the street, and we had thrown up over we threw up all over the place over each other. Literally, we're all muddy and dirty and look like shit. And I remember to this day, simultaneously, we looked at each other and we said, man, that was killer.
With throw up all over you. This is great.
Isn't this great, man? And to the people who are non-alcoholic, they're like, I would never do that again. And for a punk like me, it was like, okay, let's do this again. And so I'd like to say that pretty much at that particular time, the switch for alcoholism was turned on, and I wasn't a daily drinker at that age, but certainly a binge drinker. Right around the corner in high school, this area was just dominated by, it's just a little beach town with all sorts of people having backyard keg parties, and that's what we did all the time. And it was very normal. There was nothing out of the ordinary about it. My mother had remarried, and I can remember this one thing that happened. I was 17, and I had been drinking. I came home, and I always had a really early curfew. It was one of my primary resentments as a kid. I was like, shit, I got to be home like at 10:30, and like 17, everyone could stay out till 1 a.m. But I'd get home, and or I got home in this particular instance, and my stepdad just was, have you been drinking? And I just denied it. I haven't been drinking. And he says, you've been drinking. And he got really upset. He was a gnarly guy too, just like my father. And he slapped me around a bit, and something that had never happened before. And with tears in his eyes, he looked at me and says, I don't want to lose you. And when I look at times like, when I think about things like that, it's like the writing was already on the wall for me. at such a young age, and my stepfather could tell I was already having a problem with alcohol, and narcotics had already entered the picture. I really became involved heavily in cocaine, but everything changed to me in the late '80s when I was going to college in San Diego and it hurt my back. And this is the pill epidemic, or the opioid epidemic wasn't even being discussed at the time. I was prescribed Vicodin, had this gnarly back surgery, and I fell in love with that drug, and it graduated to Norco. And then next thing you know, I have multiple doctors, and then I was introduced to OxyContin. And I was addicted to prescription painkillers for almost 17 years. And I don't want to get too long-winded on the problem here, but along the way, one of the things that what I know now is that when drugs and alcohol are working, even though it's a problem to people who are seeing it clearly on the outside, for a guy like myself, if I'm getting the effect and that's produced by drugs and alcohol, it's very difficult for you to tell me I have a problem. Or excuse me, you can tell me. It's just very difficult for me to take any action.
And people, there have been so many times where they will say, here are some black and white facts, and this is why I've come to the conclusion that you have a problem, and I am telling you this because I love you. And I know for myself, my immediate defense was, you're wrong, or you can't hang, you don't understand. I never even accepted that statement. Were you consciously aware that there was a problem, or were you just sort of in that denial state?
I always pushed. I'm an extremist for sure, and so there was nothing casual about the way I drank or used. I wasn't even one of these people. They talk about this definition of insanity, of repeating the same things over and over and expecting different results. I call bullshit on that, man. For me personally, I always knew that when I drank, that it was going to end up just thrashed. I was never predicting a different result. In fact, I wanted to take it to as far as I could. And so, to kind of piggyback on what you just said, people, if they were to call you out on a problem or this is an issue, my first thing is just stick it up your ass. F you, man. I don't even want to hear it. However, left alone long enough, especially, I'd be like, I have an issue, man. But there was no readiness. There was no readiness and certainly no willingness to want to approach or broach the subject, which certainly became life-threatening for me later on.
So what was the catalyst that made you decide I need to do something?
Yeah. I had made 2 very weak attempts prior to 2007 I wanted to get physically detoxed off of the painkillers. I just never wanted to touch painkillers again. I just couldn't get off of those damn things. And the first 2 times, and if you want to call it rehab or a detox unit, I left early against medical advice because the discomfort for me was so gnarly. It was so indescribably uncomfortable that I just left with my hospital bracelet. I'd go straight to the dealers, or whether it was Coke dealer, pill dealer, I had to get everything that I had to get and just get back on that bus. But in towards the back end of 2006, I'd lost my mind, and something was seriously frying upstairs in my brain. And a couple months later, I was starting to see people behind the back of my home in these bushes. They weren't even there. I was delusional. I was under total cocaine psychosis. The opioids had completely fractured my brain, and I couldn't even conjugate sentences very well. I couldn't speak articulately. And so one of the things that stands out for me was a moment where when I was seeing some guy in a bush who I thought wanted to kill me, and I called the police, and from the second story window of my bedroom, they're like, "We want to come talk to you, sir. There's nobody here." And I said, "No, that's okay." And I remember just crumbling to my knees, I went downstairs to my kitchen area on the tile floor and just was like, "God, I don't know what I'm doing, and I sure as hell don't know how to help myself." That was the moment I knew that I needed to do something. And I did not want my mother to get a phone call that her son had died from an overdose or from this disease. And to further that, I'm also convinced that people do die of broken hearts. And I think that if I would have died that way, that my mother quite possibly could have died from a broken heart, because we have a very special relationship. So yeah, so on February 16th of 2007, I somehow managed to drive my car to a hospital in South Laguna Beach, brought them jars and jars of pills that I still had. I was inconsolable. I just could barely talk, and handed them over all this shit. And I said that I'm dying from this. And they said, that's clear. That is obvious. And that was my start. So my sobriety date was the following day.
When you start to get sober, is it an easy path for you, or is there a lot of
Well, I'll gladly touch on, my first year of recovery was the most terrifying year of my life. And to give the people who are listening or watching a snapshot, I did not sleep for 44 days. I was on, for a great deal of those years of being addicted to the opioids, a lot of it was synthetic, and I was on a great deal of fentanyl and the OxyContin, the big 80 milligram pills. It's very slow to leave your system. And so my story is that I desperately wanted to sleep. My body was just in shambles, but my mind would not slow down. So it was absolutely terrifying for me. I just tossed and turned and just slobbered for the first few months of my sobriety. And I shook physically for almost 9 months. Like you would think I'd be having a stroke if I was walking down the street. I don't think recovery and the physical symptoms that I experienced were very, very intense. And that's what prompted me to write my memoir, Dying for Triplicate, not because I wanted so much attention, but I fell into this passion of helping others. And my treating physician said that people have got to hear the story because he had never seen anything like it. And gratefully speaking, that the book has helped several thousand people find recovery.
When you wrote that book, it wasn't like you said, it wasn't about getting attention or look at how crazy my story is that I went harder than everybody else. This was more of just a kind of reflection, and that you can help people with it. What's going through your mind when you decided to start writing the book?
Well, I just started writing, and I wrote the damn thing in 18 months sober, and I had very little recovery in me, certainly very little spirituality. It was more about the terror that we go through while addicted, and I think that's why it has spoken to so many people who suffer with this disease. I told the truth, right, wrong, or indifferent. I told the fucking truth, and the truth sometimes hurt. I'd say 95% of the people have gotten something out of it. You're always going to have people who bash you or want to do whatever, and at the end of the day, I have hundreds of emails from moms and from people who read the book going, my kid found treatment because this, or, some dude going, dude, I got 6 months sober because I felt like, because you did it, I could. That is what it is all about. It's kind of like, it's funny in our rooms. It's like anonymity is important. By the way, if you mentioned at the top of the show, I mentioned that I'm a proud member of a 12-step program. I'm not going to tell you which one it is by way of, I'll tell you privately. How about this? It's the oldest one that exists. But that's not breaking tradition. And so I was in a lot of fear when I wrote the book, Andrew. I was, of course, I still had that mind of what are people going to think and all that stuff. At the end of the day, it's been nothing but a positive. But it's been out for a handful of years now, and it's been read by a lot of people who I think needed to read it when they needed to read it. Yeah,
and I want to rewind a little bit. Why don't you tell us a bit about the Long Beach music scene in the 80s, 90s, and who you were running with and what was going on back then? Because I think that's a really cool perspective of, even though, at this point in the story, you've gotten sober, but if we rewind a bit to what was going on back then, I think that's a really, really interesting piece of your life.
Oh, okay. Well, for sure. I mean, we had a thriving scene here in Long Beach, and the band that I really fell into and fell in love with at a very young age was called the Falling Idols, and that was a local punk band that, today 2 of those members are in much bigger bands. One of them's a singer of the Vandals. a world-renowned punk band, and then the bass player is a bass player for Pennywise today, and you've probably heard of those bands. Started with the Falling Idols, but there were so many other bands in this area. We had people like the Vandals and Secret Hate and Rhino 39 and Tex and the Horseheads, and these amazing players and crazy people. But what came about later on was some guys that I grew up with formed a band called Sublime, and a lot of people love their music. And I don't know if you've heard of the band before, but
vaguely familiar.
Vaguely. Okay, that's good. So,
he says sarcastically.
Are you a fan of the band?
Yeah.
Right on. I had some of my best times with those guys, with Bud, Eric, and Brad, and certainly some of the most heartbreaking times. It was a wild ride, watching them grow into what was going to become, a world-renowned band. And for those of you, a lot of people know the story that Brad Knoll died on May 25th, 1996 of a heroin overdose. And I was up in San Francisco when this happened. I wasn't in the room, but I had just dropped him off after their last show. And to my knowledge, I was the last person he tried to call before he died. And I wasn't able to wake up. And it disturbed me for many, many years. And the progression of my disease went into darker and darker places. It ate me alive because I didn't have any coping skills, and we had lost a guy that we cared deeply for and we loved a lot. And 1 week prior to that, we were at his wedding. 1 week prior, and he's dead a week later, and he leaves behind this. He had a beautiful wife, and he had a baby boy named Jacob. But there's a lot of good stuff to the story too. Much later. Jacob was only 10 or 11 months old when Brad passed. So, I had some incredibly insane times with him. I mean, going all over the place, with spending time with those guys on tour, and I was in a bunch of their music videos. If you haven't seen it, the Date Rape is a song that broke them on KROQ and it bled out to the rest of the country. And the band was on tour. They asked me if I wanted to star in the video, and I was like, yeah, what the hell? And so we did this
great video.
What's that?
It's when you put the pieces together, when I realized that was you in it, it's like, yes.
Have you seen the video?
I've seen the video. But describe what happens in the video.
Oh yeah, what's really funny, if you want to call it funny, but the legendary buzzkill Ron Jeremy is not only the judge in the film, but he's also the guy who rapes me in jail, because the song is not about promoting date rape. It's actually it's an upbeat song, but the underlying message is that there's some terrible consequences as a result of doing such a thing. And so just to be very clear, I don't take that subject matter lightly at all, but the song is on the lighter side. It's a fun sounding song, but that's a song that broke them. And they rarely even played it. So yes, I was in that video, and it was absolutely insane. And I was certainly not close to getting sober yet. I think we filmed that in 1995. But yeah, so the scene was just rich with a pretty a wealthy cast of characters who like to push the envelope the way I did. And I can tell you that one of the things that I'm waving to a neighbor. One of the things that I really loved about the guys in Sublime is that very, very few rules applied. And that fits for a guy like me just perfectly. It's like wherever we're going, if it's not bolted down, we're fucking taking it. If the girls are coming with us, and whoever's left behind on the floor bleeding, so be it.
So it was literally the sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Oh my God, to the umpteenth, yeah, and that was even before they were super famous. God, I couldn't even imagine what was. But I haven't told this story to a lot of people. A few people know about it, but Brad said, this is about 9 months before he passed. He said, "Hey Z-Man," he goes, "You have your pilot's license?" I go, "Pilot's license? Like, I'm lucky to be able to drive a car. I'm lucky I can just drive the streets of California." He goes, "Because when we make it big, I want us to be like Led fucking Zeppelin, and I want you to fucking fly the 747 we're gonna." He was serious. And I was like, wait a minute. You want me to fly the plane? First and foremost, who the hell is going to even allow me to fly any plane? I'm lucky to get on a plane, right? But it used to be a running joke because, I mean, I can only imagine what things would have been like if we had an airplane running around and absolutely burning every village.
The insanity of you guys just on private jets on top of all the other craziness, taking it to that next level. So you had touched on Brad left behind his new wife and son, but you stayed in touch with them later on down the road. Do you want to get into what that relationship turned into?
Well, I always had a very good kinship and friendship with Brad's father, Jim, known as Papa Noel. So Papa Noel and I have spent a great deal of time together over the last few decades. And so my relationship with him, to me, he's very much like a father figure. He's one of the most respected men that in Long Beach here that, from my crew, we all have a great deal of respect and love and admiration for him as a father, as a businessman, as a man who walks the walk and talks the talk. He's just an honest, good guy. And so with a huge heart. Jacob, when Jacob was a baby, he was living with his mother, Troy, down in San Diego. And I would see him sparingly. I would definitely make the drive down to see him as he was growing up. But, we all had our own lives too. I was in a band. I was doing my shit up in Long Beach and San Clemente. I had a home in San Clemente, which is the furthest southern. It's the southernmost little town in South Orange County before you get to San Diego. So I was running amok there, and certainly just insane. And so some years you drift apart and stuff like that. But I was still relatively connected with my crew here in Long Beach until my disease progressed, and then I was very isolated. Really isolated, man, for not just a couple weekends, a long time.
Jacob kind of followed the path of his dad, not apples to apples, but he ran into trouble as well. And didn't you have some sort of impact on his life as well?
Well, as he grew into he started drinking at a young age, and so in time, he developed that thing called alcoholism, as well as addiction qualities as well. And so later on down the road, you fast forward a bunch of years, man, I ended up becoming the intervention work found me. I wasn't like, oh yeah, I'm sober, I'm gonna go to work for a treatment center. Mm-hmm. I've never worked for a treatment center.
That is a lot of people's path.
It's a lot of people's path, and I've seen too many people make that their recovery. And I've also seen them fall and get hurt. I've always put my sobriety, my own personal recovery is the first most important thing to me. I still go to, on the low side, 5, but usually the 6 to 8 meetings a week still. At 12 years and 4 months of sobriety, I have this disease just as much today as the day that I came in, and I need it just as much.
You're taking that air quote medicine continually, and one of the things that someone in my circle had said, he says, 12-step recovery, it's not something that it worked and you got better. It is work. It is working in your life. So he equates it to he's a property manager, and he was like, they had hired a security guard and crime went down, and they were like, well, we can't afford to keep paying this security guard, and crime's down, so we don't really need one. And he's like, it is working. It is not it worked. And recovery, it's the same way.
I can appreciate that for sure. We've all seen it. Sounds like you've been around long enough too, or maybe even longer than me, but it's just, if you stick around the rooms of recovery long enough, we see people who get a good life back and they deprioritize or reprioritize what's most important. And some of those people end up either dead or they're out there drinking and getting loaded again, and they're not coming back. And that scares me to pieces. I'm thankful. That hasn't been my story at all up to this point. I haven't drifted. I haven't been like, I'll give it a month off. Dude, I get crazy in 48 hours. Like, not the obsession about drinking or getting loaded, but I get emotionally displaced quite easily. And it's just how I am wired. And so being amongst people like you and, in the rooms of recovery worldwide, as long as I'm in one of those rooms, I get more centered and I get closer to something much bigger than myself quickly. And I need it.
I tend to find that when I just sit down and listen at times, it just happens to be, and call it coincidence for X years in a row over and over, but whenever I'm going through something and I sit down in one of those rooms and I just listen, I always end up hearing the exact thing, A, that I don't want to hear, and then B, that I need to hear. Yeah. And, then I'm faced with, do I act on this? Do I just keep that to myself and be like, you said exactly, because usually it's something wrong with, actually not even sometimes, it's always something wrong with me, either internally or something going on in my life. I have some sort of expectation on someone or something to act a certain way, and invariably every time, and I own several companies, and I'll get upset with an employee, and then I just come back around to, well, what was my part in it? Which I hate in 12-step recovery, that my brain is now wired that way, that I take accountability and responsibility for all the things that I'm not happy with. But I'll be upset with someone. Oh, what's this person doing at work? They're, wasting money and wages and all these things. And it's like, well, have you clearly defined the expectations of the job or the role that they have? And it's like, no, they should read my mind. And when that's my reasoning for being upset with someone, it ultimately falls on me. And as a sober man and as a business owner and all these different things, everything does rise and fall on my shoulders. But at the same time, that's a blessing, because if I am part of the problem, I also have the ability to be part of the solution. And until I got involved in recovery, I blamed everybody else. It was everyone else's fault why my life had gone to hell. And if you lived the way that I lived with the people who I surrounded myself with, you would drink the same way that I drank, because you don't even have a choice. There's no alternative when you're a victim.
Yeah, a lot of this has to do with just the way I think, my reaction to life, and there's that classic story that's my favorite couple of paragraphs in that big book we have. It's about acceptance. When I am disturbed, I find some person, place, or thing, some fact of my life unacceptable to me. And until I can find acceptance with that person, place, or thing, I can have no serenity. That explains me perfectly. Absolutely to a T. And so generally speaking, the problem with me is me. Now, if some guy cuts me off and flips me off, what's my spiritual condition like on that particular day? I've had plenty of moments in sobriety where I have wanted to punch someone in the throat. I haven't. I can tell you, back in the day, I caused a lot of scenes that resulted in very, very negative results, but I haven't had to do that. And so, I want to come back to this thing with Jacob, and, I became a family crisis interventionist. I've facilitated over 400 of them all over the country over the last 9+ years, and I was trained appropriately. I didn't just read a book. I was taken under the wing of a master interventionist who had over 1,000 interventions under his belt. He said, I think that you could really connect well with people who have suffered like you. So why don't you want to give this a shot with me? And I did, and I learned the right way to facilitate intervention, and I got my certification for drug and alcohol counseling and my licensing and all that stuff. But, whoever would have thought that, I think it was 4 years ago, so I was 8 years sober, that I got a call from Jim Knoll saying that his grandson Jacob is suffering with this disease. And he said verbatim, he goes, I can't go through it again. I can't go through it again. And so it was one of the most beautiful moments in my life to be able to actually take that call, where before I wasn't able to take Brad's call because he just wanted to talk to a friend at the time. I don't know what. He didn't want dope from me. He had dope. He didn't want money from me. He had money. He just wanted to talk to someone. So it kind of, I'm not saying it evens the playing field or the scales are even, But being able to help Jacob get clean and sober has been one of the true bright spots in my life.
And it's great that you had, no one likes the negatives that come along with life. And obviously that was a huge, huge impact on you and all the people in that circle. And I mean, worldwide, I mean, they just on the surface level of the music and things like that. I mean, it was a huge loss all around, but to be able to have that awareness that, here is that same exact call, and that you now have the skills and ability to not only take that call, but be able to perform the way that, I mean, you just didn't have any capacity or capability to handle back then, but to be able to take those skills now and apply them and save his life. I mean, that's effectively what we do when we help other addicts and alcoholics. You are saving a life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there is no greater purpose than for us to be able to, pass on what was not only given to us, but at the same time, we talk about this often, passing on what was freely given to us. At the same time, I feel an extreme duty, an extreme sense of responsibility that for a new man, I need to be able to look that man in the eye and tell that guy, you know what, I love you, man, and I want to see you make some changes. I want to encourage that person to stick around. All this hardcore bullshit, some of these old fuckers who just sit down and shut up and we don't want to hear you. You know what the truth is? We need to hear the new man. In fact, there is a written text in the book that states meetings are a place for the new man to come share his problems. Okay. Now, I'm not expecting to hear the solution from a new guy. However, I strongly suggest that someone who is new to share in meetings what's going on with them, because it allows us to get to know them and they get to know us. Shutting up and saying nothing to me is absolutely against, to me, a principle of recovery, which is vital, which is transparency, truth, and honesty amongst people who fucking understand. And I'm seriously adamant about that, man.
And not to mention, I mean, if you're trying to grow something in membership, take the recovery aspect out of it, but just human principle in general. If you have a group and take the this is saving your life out of the equation, but the people don't want to show up somewhere and then people say, you're not welcome here. You can't participate because you don't know what you're talking about. Listen to me. What would be your motivation to want to even go back to get to the point where you can say that? And I mean, there's things that I'll say this to my salesmen, because sometimes we have these weird situations where things pan out, but statistically, majority of the time, it doesn't work. Like I had this one guy who worked for me in tech, fixing computers. Super, super abrasive guy. Really, really just fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. But some people absolutely loved it. And other people, I had received an email from a customer saying, I am willingly driving 25 miles to go to a competitor instead of just calling you and having it done remotely because I am frightened that he will be the one that answers the phone. So we eventually got rid of him, but then other people were like, no, I love that. And it was like, it was a minority of them. But so sometimes I think some people like that. They show up and people say, shut up, don't talk. And they keep coming back because they like the pain or whatever it is. But it's not the majority, it's the minority. And I think people, they take things out of context and they say, look, here is that small percentage of the time where it worked. And we just use that confirmation bias that because it worked on this small percentage, that therefore it works all the time, every time for these exact types of people. But in the macro, if you're trying to, something works 80% of the time the opposite way, why stop doing it the way that encourages membership and encourages growth, which is ultimately what we need.
Yeah, and the rooms have evolved too. It's the text remains the same, but the personnel, the people who are in the rooms, there's going to come a point in time. Hate to say it, gang, but in certain groups, drugs are going to be a part of almost every single person's story in the group. The wild turkey days and just the straight bourbon guys are going to be gone eventually. Sorry, it's just the way. Drugs are a big part of the story, not part of the program where we don't really talk about that much, but it's all a part of us. At the end of the day, you know what, man? At the end of the day, there's groups for everyone everywhere. You know what I mean? You want the hard ass thing, the full Third Reich treatment where you have no say, or I don't know where those are, but so be it, man. I just want people to get sober and live better. I don't care where you find it, and thank God it's everywhere.
Yeah, so your book you had touched on, you were able to help tens of thousands of people through just that one thing. And now with the documentary, The Long Way Back, how did that come about?
I was not seeking like, hey, let me go find someone to make a movie about me. I was contacted by a gentleman up in Canada who had produced some films in the science-based and learning areas, and he was privy to the epidemic. He's like, your story needs to be told. Flew up there a couple of times, and we started going to some finance raising stages, and it kind of came to find that he wasn't the right guy to tell the story. But along the road, some investors were like, meet this guy, introduced me to this guy who was attached to some Sundance winning awards. His name's Mike Meeker, and he ended up producing the film. And well, you talk about uncomfortable, man. I mean, you really go through your mind thinking, wait a minute, we're going to let it all hang out here. And for me, there was no other way to tell the story. When I wrote my book, I still hadn't tackled the demons. I got to talk about this because I don't care anymore, but about trauma sustained as a kid, molestation, and coming from being a victim to a survivor. And I was really flipping coins on, do I reveal that in the film? At the end of the day, thank goodness I had grown up enough as a man to be able to share that experience and not worry about being judged. Because it's all about, at the end of the day, I can't tell you how many people reached out to me going, dude, I always thought I had to be this tough guy, et cetera, et cetera. That happened to me as a kid too. And I've hurt a lot of people along the way, not molesting, but I've hurt others with my alcoholism because of a lot of this stuff that happened as a kid. So, the film project in itself, it got done in a year. Usually they take about 2 years on average to make a feature length. We went 60, 70-hour weeks. We won a couple of awards for Best Documentary Film, gratefully speaking. And the people at the Orchard, owned by Sony, put it out, and it's available on basically every medium except Netflix. It's been a really good platform to speak at schools, to speak at not just treatment centers, but a lot of universities I go to and high schools. So it's been a really great thing to share with people and then give a talk after. It's helped a bunch of people. It's pretty cool.
And when you're doing the speaking gigs at colleges, is that just something where was that sort of part of your plan to speak at colleges, or how did that come about?
When the film came out, I just started getting people asking, we'd love to have you come out and talk. And I've always enjoyed giving talks about getting to the other side. I also do a lot of 12-step talks too, but speaking on an institutional level is different. You're not going to incorporate too much step talk, et cetera, because it's such a foreign thing. But I got to tell you, I can't count the times I've been pulled aside and someone saying, I either need help right now. I've got a couple of people like, I was literally going to kill myself this week. I was going to freaking kill myself. And I remember we got a counselor at this one, I was in Ohio. We got this counselor to take this person over to the student center, and they got that person into an institution like that night. I mean, this is real stuff, man. When people are breaking inside and they're too scared to talk about it, I want to share with anyone who's listening or watching, whatever, it's okay to talk about it. If you're breaking on the inside, find someone who you trust, someone who will care about what you have to hear. I assure you there's people who want to hear from you. Don't leave because you're going to be killing the wrong person.
I think a lot of it too, alcoholics and addicts kind of run into this thought process of I am unique. Nobody else understands the kind of pain that I'm going through because I had this experience. And if you had this experience, then you would understand, but nobody has this experience. And I think that's why, when you were talking about your trauma, that so many people, I mean, it's one of those things that you're not supposed to talk about it, and having that guilt and shame trapped inside of you. And I believe you had said in the documentary that you had tried sharing it with people and they said they didn't believe you. Was that part of the case also?
Yeah, I shared it with my father. I was really young. I was only like 9 years old. And it happened again. I was very blanket statement because I was actually affected several times over a 2-year period. I just made a general statement about it. So my father didn't believe me. And so what that did to me too was it instilled this, I'm really, really, really against authority. I'm really against it. And I'm going to grow up one day. And I did. And people who would try to tell me what to do would not get the answer they were looking for. It sets the stage. It shapes you. It crafts you into something. I didn't become a monster, by the way. In fact, I was a person who, if I ever saw a person getting picked on, I would just lose my mind. Getting bullied or, I was kind of like, I wanted to be like the Superman to help people,
Well, so. Effectively, that's what has happened with the content that you've put out and with your work in doing interventions and things like that. I mean, that is sticking up for the person that is just suffering. And I know when I was at the end of my rope and, I just needed a DUI and a judge to tell me that I needed help. But for all the times when people, it felt like family and friends were ganging up on me, when I know now in retrospect, they were just trying to help. But I felt like the guy who was just a victim the entire time because that's what my brain told me. I was a victim. I was the underdog. I didn't have anyone on my side.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Andrew, because, my take on a lot of this is that the person who is in the disease is truly not seeing the world clearly. And there's people, obviously in your instance and in mine too, where they're observing you, me, and like this, you are not right. They are seeing things much more clearly, and they see something that is either a crisis or a situation like something has to change. And so it's getting, that's why I love about the work is you always get this loving, determined group of people who is hell bent on saving their loved one's life. And so it's essentially this emotional management of chess pieces that you're dealing with these people and personnel to get this person motivated to at least try to change. And so it's been rewarding work. It's very taxing for me. I take it, I do take it very, very seriously. I think you have to.
Yeah, I don't think that's the kind of job that you can just 9 to 5 punch the clock and just kind of coast.
No, you can't. And you can't do back-to-back interventions. Like, yeah, there has to be breathing space between each one. I've made that mistake on 2 occasions, and I paid for it dearly, becoming very off-center, very not 100%. And so you have to catch up, get back into your own recovery, do some self-care, and get yourself back on that beam and allow you to be more functional.
But at least you have the awareness that you made the mistake in the past, you reflected on it, and moving forward, you're not just beating your head against the wall trying to do that insanity definition of the same thing, expecting different results. And when we can reflect on the mistakes that we've made and then make decisions on the future, doing the next right move, this can apply for recovery. It can apply to business. I know when we were growing the company and it was like, well, I just hired a bunch of random people and they all happened to work out wonderfully. And so then my mentality was, we should always hire just random people. And it kept blowing up in my face that we kept having these terrible employees that would show up for like a day or two and quit. We had people, and now the company, everybody's sober, but we had people like nodding out at their desk, and it was just like, what is this? And I was like, well, maybe we should just add like one step, like 1 ounce of, maybe just make sure that this person kind of has some of the same ideas. But we could have kept going the same way. And the unfortunate thing in business is, if I have 20 salesmen and they're all mediocre, we're still probably making more money than we would if we had 3 people that were stellar. So it's learning to sacrifice more money, which isn't the ultimate scoreboard, but doing the right thing and knowing that you're doing the right thing, sticking behind it, even when you don't get that financial reward for it. And so I don't know how the payment structure works in interventions. I would assume that if you did 2 in a day, you would get paid twice as much. Is that accurate, or is it more of a...
Yeah, that would be impossible to do 2 in a day. I think I'd be hanging from a tree.
Yeah.
You just couldn't do it. But yeah, I follow you.
Yeah. So in wrapping up, what piece of advice would you give to somebody who is struggling with addiction, looking to get out? What would be the next best move for them to take?
Well, the first thing that I want to say to anyone out there who's suffering is that it's very difficult to do it alone. I don't suggest it. That there's a lot of people out there who, on a professional level, first off, to get you started, specialize in getting you stabilized. That's what treatment's about to me. You don't just go to treatment and you emerge and you're good to go the rest of your life. I think it's a great place to be safe for a while. There's a lot of good ones, a lot of bad ones, but there's a lot of good places out there, people who know what they're doing to get you started. And that it can be done, but it's just, I need to focus on none of it's done alone. And if you felt alone, I'm sure you have, if you're suffering, that it's a huge relief to know that you don't have to be alone again. So I would encourage you to reach out and it's okay to say, I'm breaking, man. I need some help. There's nothing wrong with that.
And one other thing that I had heard you had spoke about with, I think it was Anna David, about Bradley's house.
Uh-huh.
You want to touch on that a bit? I think that's an incredible thing that you guys are putting together.
Yeah, for sure. If I could just touch on 2 quick things. Bradley's house is essentially under what's called the Knoll Family Foundation, and it's something I co-founded with Brad's dad. We are it's a fully approved 501c3 company that's nonprofit. We are geared towards creating the first treatment center of its kind, which is to help musicians who are suffering with substance use disorder, who are broken, who don't have the financial means to get well. And so the residence will be called Bradley's House. We're still in the fundraising stage for it. And so it's something that we're very excited about getting actually the doors open, which God willing, it'll happen over the next year. The other thing I want to comment on really quick is I'm working on a project that's called the Higher Ground Experience, and it's an experiential learning platform for kids, for young people to reach them before they start using, before they start drinking. And it's an incentivized learning program that we're currently in the finance raising stage, for which is going to have significant impact on helping young people to make the right decisions in peer pressure situations. So check it out, Andrew, and you can go to highergroundexperience.com, and we expect to help some kids avoid overdose and funerals.
That's such a great cause, and I think it's cool with the idea that, like the niching down on the musicians with Bradley's house, where we feel that no one else can understand exactly what we're going through. And who better to be running this organization than people who have been directly involved in addiction and in the music scene, and knowing that there's the little differences here and there, that it's not always going to be apples to apples. And that's kind of what I was hoping to accomplish with the podcast, was you can go to 12-step meeting and find people that have your same vice. However, for myself, it was kind of scratching my own itch of, I want to be not only with just the people in the rooms, And it doesn't have to just be people who are also in 12-step recovery, just people who are sober. Whatever method works for you. But to be able to network and meet with people that are doing big things, that you can't always just walk into a room and find someone who is starting 501c3 and getting funding and all these things. So it's really cool, and I really appreciate you taking the time and letting us in on your story and the things you've been through and the triumphs and the wins and the losses. And Todd, in wrapping up, how can people find you and get more information?
Oh, thanks for asking. You can go to my website. It's toddzalkins.com, TODDZALKINS, toddzalkins.com. I also have a toll-free number, 888-604-7370. And I want to say one more thing first off, thank you, Andrew, for having me. I want to finish with, for anyone out there who's wondering if recovery is worth it, it is. And if I didn't have a joyful, meaningful existence in sobriety, I'd bail. I would have bailed a long time ago, despite what life has thrown at me. So if you're wondering, first off, yes, you can get there. Takes some stuff, takes a little bit of work, but I assure you that if you're sick of it all, man, this is a lot better. It's a lot better.
Yeah, people don't end up there on accident, but the people that stay, it was intentional, and
I like that.
It's not something that just comes easy. And it's like you said, with treatment, a lot of people think it's like a 30-day thing, kind of like get surgery and then you're fixed. It's just laying down the framework, get the foundation. But unfortunately, there's work to be done ahead, and it's not going to just take 1 month to fix everything. It is a thing that it works as long as you continue doing the things that cause it to work. And sometimes we start taking credit for things that aren't necessarily our doings. But it's been great talking with you, Todd. And everyone who's listening, check out Todd and all the things that he's been doing. The Long Way Back, great documentary, really, really digs into his story. The book, Dying for Triplicate, all the things that he's doing. It's so great to have this experience with you, to have you share with the audience, and have a great day. Thank you so much for being, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's been a pleasure, man.
Thank you so much for listening to Self-Made and Sober. Be sure to join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/SMC Mastermind, like Self-Made Coaching Mastermind. I hope you enjoyed the show, and be sure to subscribe and rate the show so you can get notified each Friday when we put out a new episode.